laws of the Castle Doctrine. The Castle Doctrine protects the right of homeowners who use deadly force to protect their homes in the face of imminent danger. Stand Your Ground takes it a bit further and states that a person can justifiably use force in self-defense when there is reasonable belief of an unlawful threat without an obligation to retreat first. So put plainly, if you feel that you are in danger, you do not have to retreat, you do not have to hide, you can stand your ground. Not all states have adopted the Castle Doctrine, and not all Castle Doctrine states have a stand your ground clause. Obviously, there's considerable controversy regarding stand your ground. One of the main reasons being that it's very difficult to prove self-defense once an incident has already taken place. Texas and Florida have some of the most liberal stand your ground laws. Some people have called Florida the Wild Wild West because since enacting the stand your ground law in 2006, over 218 cases have cited stand your ground in their defense. 127 of those cases were fatal. There was a research study actually done at Texas A&M regarding stand your ground, and the research study found that states that had stand your ground laws had a higher homicide rate than states without the stand your ground law. Now, anyone doing research knows that it's very difficult to prove change or to prove anything with only one variable, but I think the correlation is definitely worth acknowledging. One of the other major aspects or major concerns regarding stand your ground is the lack of equal protection under the law. For those of you who are over the age of 10, I would say, this is not uncommon here in this country. So despite the fact that the law is supposed to protect those people who have stood in self-defense, we know that when the shooter is of African descent, that this is not always the case. They are not always protected equally as their other racial counterparts, thus making this conversation that much more important. I want to remind people that we are not here this evening to discuss gun control or to discuss black-on-black violence, both of which are very important issues, and yes, they do relate to stand your ground and Trayvon Martin in some aspect. But both of those subject areas require more time than we can give them in this space today, and deserve more time than we can give them in this space today. So I just want to keep that in mind. I'd like to go ahead and to introduce our esteemed panelists. First and foremost, to my right, is Dr. Anthony Monteiro. He's a distinguished lecturer in African American Studies and Associate Director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Thought at Sankofa University, where he teaches courses on African American and social political thought. He is well known for his work on W.E.B. Du Bois and the building of political institutions in Philadelphia Black community, especially those in North Philadelphia. His many publications include 2 forthcoming books, one on the analytical Marxism and another on the importance of W.E.B. Du Bois' thoughts for philosophy of human science. Let's welcome Dr. Monteiro. Seated next to Dr. Monteiro is Joaquin Miller. He's an author, teacher, and social commentator. He has 6 years of collective experience in both K-12 and higher education as a program coordinator, teacher, trainer, and student advisor. Currently, Mr. Miller is a history teacher at Leap Academy Charter High School, located in Camden, New Jersey. He is also chief executive of MORE Incorporated, MORE standing for Manifesting Opportunities for Renewal and Empowerment, a nonprofit organization that works with African American male youth. Mr. Miller is also the author of Double D's of Destruction, How a Distracted and Desensitized Consciousness is Destroying Our Communities and Failing Our Children. He is married and currently resides with his wife and son in southern New Jersey. Let's welcome Mr. Miller. Last but certainly not least is my brother, Mr. Gabriel Bryant. He's a Philadelphia-based educator and activist by way of Brooklyn, New York. He serves as the director for the Young Men's Initiative at Philadelphia Futures, a nonprofit organization which seeks to get low-income, first-generation students from Philadelphia's neighborhood high schools to and through college. He is also the co-director for Sankofa Community Empowerment, Philadelphia Chapter, and a member of the Askia Coalition Against Police Brutality. In addition to serving on the planning committee for the Black Male Development Symposium, Gabriel also hosts the internet radio show Stepping Into Tomorrow on gtownradio.com each Thursday at 8 p.m. Make sure you tune in. Just to refresh your memory, I'd like to go over a few brief points about the Trayvon Martin murder and update you on what's going on with his case since then. As you remember, Trayvon Martin was shot and killed at the age of 18 by George Zimmerman, who was the neighborhood watch coordinator. Prior to the shooting, Zimmerman called the police and stated that he suspected Martin of illegal activity due to the fact that he was walking in between homes and walking leisurely, end quote. The police informed Zimmerman that what Trayvon Martin was doing was not illegal and that there was no need to approach him. Zimmerman left the security of his car and approached Trayvon Martin. What we know in terms of what follows is that Trayvon Martin was shot at close range in the chest and was killed. Zimmerman claims that he was acting out of self-defense and that he was actually attacked by Trayvon Martin. The police questioned Zimmerman for 5 hours, and they also found that Zimmerman was within his rights to kill and murder Trayvon Martin. After a national outcry, the DA finally brought charges against Zimmerman 40 days later, unfortunately, in April of 2012, and he's being charged with second-degree murder. Since that time, Zimmerman has raised over $300,000 in donations to pay for legal fees and to maintain his standard of living. He's also gained 105 pounds, which happens usually to people who have guilty consciences, I would say. Zimmerman supporters have tried to tarnish Trayvon Martin's name in order to draw attention away from Zimmerman's vigilante-like tactics, but we know and understand, again, this is a tactic and that it can't actually disprove that Zimmerman was in the wrong. Trayvon Martin would have turned 18 this past February 5th. His family held a candlelight vigil for Trayvon. There were about 70 people in attendance. If you're thinking 70 people is not a lot, you're right. That's a lot less than many of the vigils that some of us attended last year and a lot of the rallies that we attended last year in honor, seeking justice for Trayvon Martin. You can see in the graph that since Trayvon Martin's case has fallen from the media spotlight, a lot of people have forgotten about this incident, but we haven't, and that's why we're here this evening. I'd like to highlight 4 other cases regarding Stand Your Ground in order to provide further context for this discussion beyond the case of Trayvon Martin. Please bear with me that I'm going to briefly discuss these and understand that there are a lot more facts that go into each of these cases. So I encourage you to do your own research beyond what I'm going to discuss this evening. First, I'd like to highlight the case of Jordan Davis. Jordan Davis has a case very similar to that of Trayvon Martin. By show of hands, how many of you have heard of Jordan Davis? Excellent. Similar to Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis was also murdered at the young age of 17 at the hands of shooter Michael Dunn. He was murdered at a gas station following a verbal altercation over loud, I like reading this in all the articles, rap music. As in rap music, the term rap is a derogatory term. Michael Dunn asked Davis and the young men in the car to turn the music down, and according to Dunn, the young men threatened him and brandished a shotgun. Fearing for his life, Dunn says that he went back to his car, retrieved his own firearm, and then shot 9 shots into Davis's car. Dunn then fled the scene. He was arrested the next day, 159 miles away from the incident. He claimed that he didn't think anyone had been hurt from his 9 gunshots. This supposed shotgun that was brandished by Davis and his friends were never found, and Dunn was found guilty for the murder of Jordan Davis. Next, I'd like to highlight the case of John Mcneill. In these next three cases, we'll see that persons of African descent were actually the shooter. They were the ones who invoked their right to stand their ground. John Mcneill was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment almost a year after this incident took place. Mcneill hired a carpenter, Brian Epps, to do work on his home. He subsequently fired Epps due to poor workmanship and aggressive behavior. Following Epps' firing by Mcneill and his family, Epps was found lurking in Mcneill's backyard and also threatened Mcneill's son with a knife. Mcneill went out, got his gun and went outside. He initially fired a warning shot at the ground in the hopes that this would get Epps to leave the premise. Instead, Epps charged Mcneill, and Mcneill fired the gun and shot Epps, who then died. Initially, after questioning by the police, Mcneill was not arrested. He was found within his rights to stand his ground because he was defending himself in his home. Mcneill's story was corroborated by an eyewitness who had seen the entire encounter. Again, a year later, almost a year later, 266 days later, the DA decided to bring up charges against Mcneill, and he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. 6 years after, Mcneill pled to a lesser charge of manslaughter and time served in the hopes that he'd be able to come out to see his ailing wife. He was able to plead to a lesser charge under habeas corpus. Unfortunately, Mcneill's wife died 10 days prior to Mcneill's release. It should also be noted that the NAACP did file a federal lawsuit against the state of Georgia, stating lack of equal protection under the law in the case of Mcneill. Next, I'd like to highlight the case of Trevor Dooley. Trevor Dooley was a 72-year-old man sentenced to 8 years imprisonment for manslaughter. Dooley shot and killed his neighbor, David James. The encounter started when Dooley left his home and went across the street to the local basketball court. He did have his firearm with him, and it was concealed under his shirt. A verbal altercation ensued with James over a skateboarder, at which point Dooley did brandish his firearm by lifting up his shirt. Dooley then tried to leave and was essentially attacked by David James. He grabbed him by the shoulder and wrestled him to the ground. James then began to choke Dooley, at which point he shot him. It should be noted that James was over 20 years Dooley's junior, as well as over 50 pounds heavier than Dooley. The judge did not accept Dooley's stand your ground defense, and he is currently serving time now. Last, but certainly not least, another case which many of you might have heard in the headlines is a case of Marissa Alexander. She was a 31-year-old mother, if you recall, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison for firing a warning shot at her estranged husband. Her estranged husband had also been physically abusing her, and this had also been documented. On the day in question, her estranged husband came to their home, began verbally assaulting her, and tried to block her pathway from leaving. Eventually, she was able to push past him. She went to the garage and retrieved her registered firearm from her car. She came back into the home. She fired a warning shot at her husband, her estranged husband, at which point he called the police, and she was arrested. Marissa Alexander tried to invoke her stand her ground right, but the judge denied that, claiming there is insufficient evidence that the defendant reasonably believed deadly force was needed to prevent death or great bodily harm to herself, and that the fact that she came back into the home instead of leaving out the front or back door is inconsistent with a person who is in genuine fear for her life. To compound the issue, Florida has mandatory minimum sentence laws. It's the 10-20 law. So for when a gun is used in any crime, It's 10 years for possession of a gun, 20 years if you fire the gun, and 25 years if you're found guilty of shooting someone in the committal of that crime. Alexander was also charged with child abuse for firing the gun in the presence of children. I know that I've given you a lot of information. Hopefully you'll take the time to do a bit more research about all of these cases. They all deserve their own panels, I would say, and a lot more conversation. But I'd like to get into the discussion with our panelists. First and foremost, I'd like you all to just give me your brief thoughts in light of what you just heard and what you already know about Stand Your Ground. What are your thoughts about the Stand Your Ground law? And specifically, what are your thoughts about the use of Zimmerman's supposed right to stand his ground?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
No.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jackie, for organizing this wonderful and important meeting. As far as Stand Your Ground is concerned, I think we have to separate Stand Your Ground in general and stand your ground when it's used for the purposes of racist violence, as in the case of Trayvon Martin. To me, Trayvon Martin's case has more in common with Ramallah Graham or Sean Bell, who were killed by the police, but they always claim that they're killing a young black man in self-defense, so it becomes an instance of standing your ground. So from my point of view, what we have to focus upon, and I think that which gives us a framework to understand precisely what is going on, and therefore to find appropriate action, that is to call upon masses of people to act against what is going on. We have to look at what happened to Trayvon Martin as an instance of extrajudicial murder. And by extrajudicial murder, we're talking about an individual, be he a volunteer or a police officer, taking the law in his or her hand and murdering a black person. Just the last thing I would say on this, that there's a long history of this. It is as long as the history of Africans in America. It is therefore part of the American story of racist violence. And then when we get a chance, I'd like to come back and perhaps connect what happened to Trayvon to mass incarceration and the general devaluation of black life, and in particular, the lives of African American men.
Thank you.
I would say that when I think of Trayvon and when I think of the Stand Your Ground law, what immediately comes to mind is the constant history of the fear of the young African American male. And we can look at various instances in history, we can look at current events. And as a school teacher, I see where each day, a lot of my students, African American male students, feel misunderstood. They feel like their story isn't properly understood by those around them in the world around them. And while that's dealing with identity, I think with the case of Trayvon, he was misunderstood just off the strength of what he looked like, just off the strength of preconceived ideas, preconceived notions. And it goes back to the tradition in the United States where we fear first and understand second. And I think one of the things that is most important is we need to take a moment and be a little bit more critical in our thinking and in our judgment process. And George Zimmerman's decision, his rash decision, is key and part and parcel to our tradition of just rushing to judgment, particularly when it comes to African American males. So in closing on this thought, I think that America has a problem when it comes to making rash decisions. And in the case of the African American male, whether it is psychological murder or physical murder, too often this is happening, and we're using justifications for doing so that really are pointless and do nothing but perpetuate the cycle of racism and prejudice that we've been seeing throughout our nation's history.
I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is a couple of things that's already been stated. One is that we cannot separate this Trayvon Martin story from the fierce legacy of white supremacy in this country and around the world. We need to understand, secondly, that black and brown bodies have no value, have historically never had a value, and in fact, for many people, don't want to ever have a value for black and brown bodies in this country and around the world. Until we understand these ideas, we'll never be able to fully understand our rationale and our way in which to find probable solutions for this problem. One of the things that Trayvon Martin unfortunately kind of bears in mind for me also is the way in which the media acts as the indirect fourth branch of the government. What I mean by that is this: what the media is able to do is propagandize what they want to propagandize and get you to stand up and get you to sit down. Over the course of the last year and a half, we've seen many movements that have occurred across the country that have found a way in which to galvanize the communities. We started back with Occupy Wall Street about a year and a half ago. It found a way to mobilize communities not only in America, but around the world. People were fed up. People were pointing out the contradictions globally. What's going on in regards to the economy and personal values. Then we saw Troy Davis and the legacy of Troy Davis and what happened in Georgia. And once again, everybody signed those petitions. Everybody mobilized to go down to Georgia. Everybody had town hall forums. And then, unbeknownst to us, in February of 2012, we get Trayvon Martin. But the sad part about it is that in the standing, we sit down. And so what we need to do, as far as one of our solutions, which I'm sure we're going to get to later on, is how do we, one, be able to, first of all, maintain and sustain and control our own media mechanisms, all right, but also have an infrastructure in place, whereas we have people already on the ground at all times to deal with these issues, so that people, when these situations come across, that we're not afraid, we're not acting in a reactionary manner, but we already have proactive measures in place to combat it. Because again, this is no different than what Malcolm X was doing in 1962. We're traveling to California because they were busting heads in California. There's nothing different to what Martin Luther King said in '64, talking about the major scourge of police brutality. This is King. This is King saying this, okay? And there's nothing new to the fact that right now, we're 22 years past the Rodney King verdict, and I'm so happy that Dr. Monteiro mentioned that you can't separate it from police brutality. And hopefully in the next 22 years, you'll have another Trayvon Martin or another Ramarley Graham or whomever. So I think those are just some things that we need to be thinking about.
Just to kind of piggyback off that last question, in light of the judgments against Trevor Dooley, John Mcneill, and Marissa Alexander, what are the implications for future use of stand your ground when the stand your ground law when the shooter is of African descent? And then Dr. Monteiro, if you'd also take the time to further elaborate on how you feel stand your ground is related to mass incarceration.
In a certain sense, I have to plead ignorant of some of these cases of stand your ground. And if I might say, Shasheena, the issue in the Trayvon Martin murder is not stand your ground. It's extrajudicial, targeted assassination based upon the color of Trayvon Martin's skin. Because before there was a stand your ground law, they were killing black people like this anyway. And even though stand your ground is not supposed to apply to the police and police brutality, we see this type of extrajudicial murder taking place in the North and in the South, and it's being carried out by the police departments. So I think stand your ground is not the problem. Stand your ground, the problem, forgive me, is racist murder of black people. And I think it is related to mass incarceration only if we understand the relationship between racist, and I'm going to repeat myself, extrajudicial targeted assassination of black people and the fact that 1 in 8 people incarcerated in the world is an African American male. I think the only way we can connect these things is if we see their connection to white supremacy and to racist violence. That's why I see it, Shasheena.
Well, I believe that it's always been in the United States a double standard, and the double standard continues. So if you look at these cases of stand your ground where the person who is the shooter is not an African American, but then when we flip it and the shooter is an African American, well, we know in America laws have been taken and have been shifted and manipulated to serve those in power. When you talk about white privilege and white supremacy, it's always, the law is pretty much used to keep that whole system intact. And so when we look at this issue of stand your ground and who the shooter is and who the person that's being shot, we can see the difference in standard with respect to who is getting punished and who is getting rewarded. And that double standard has always been throughout our nation. Unfortunately, those who are being hurt are people who are black and brown. And in the case of the other individuals that you mentioned, these are people who are in any normal circumstances doing what anyone else would do. If someone came to my home and they were trying to harm my family, I'm going to defend my family. I think that there's no different perspective anyone in here. If someone came to harm your family, you would do what you had to do, knife, gun, fist. You're going to do what you have to do. But the double standard is where we have this dichotomy where race begins to enter into the equation. And when you talk about the way we think, how we look at things, our preconceived ideas, these are the things that need to be changed. This is the dilemma in our society, not so much just the changing of the laws and the changing of, the way things are done in the institutions of our nation, but specifically changing mindsets. And that is what we struggle with still.
We have a sad precedent in this country when 60 to 70% of those individuals who visit our prisons daily are black women, their mothers, their wives, their girlfriends, their grandparents, black women that go to these prisons, that go to CFCF, that go to SEI Green, that go to Graterford, that go to Pick.
Cole Township.
Come on, talk about it.
Cole Township.
That's right. Huh? And they take these long bus rides to see their loved ones. These are the untold stories in this country that we must address. When I look at Sabrina Fulton on television, the mother of Trayvon Martin, and the tears that run down, that is the hugest loss. I've been told, because of course I'm not a parent, but what I've been told, to lose your son, and then to lose it in this fashion, you got to understand what these people are dealing with and what we're dealing with. This story in this case is such a precedent because for me also, we can't talk about it without connecting it to stop and frisk. Because if we take it back to the story, George Zimmerman, so-called neighborhood watch, all right? In the city of Philadelphia, in the last year, there were over 253,000 stops of stop and frisk here in Philadelphia, all right? Of those 253,000 stops, 72% of those were African-American males. And only 8% of them resulted in an arrest. 8%, you do the math. In New York City, the numbers were about 89%, and less than half, 1%, resulted in an arrest. So basically, what we're dealing with is the total interrogation, the total subjugation of black and brown people in America. And at a certain point in time, we have to get the emotion enough and the humanity enough to say enough is enough. And what are we going to do about it collectively? My last point is that it was Governor Jeb Bush who signed in the bill in 2005, the Stand Your Ground law in Florida. In 2011, it was Governor Tom Corbett. I'm getting all my Corbett's separated and confused. Governor Corbett, here in Pennsylvania, who signed in 2011. All right? So again, we're seeing a very partisan, but also a very specific approach to, as we said, the Wild Wild West, but I consider this the excessive East. Because right now we're in Pennsylvania, we're in Philadelphia, but we're still dealing with rampant attacks on our babies and our children. And so for me, the question of incarceration has become, are we going to incarcerate those individuals who are unlawful? No, we're not, because just today, Lieutenant Jonathan Josie got off for punching Ida Guzman during the Puerto Rican parade. Huh? Not guilty. It happened today at 2 o'clock. Let's talk about the stories. So again, if we're not going to be responsible and take a look at the news and how it connects to all of our people, then we're going to lose sight of this bigger picture.
Thank you. You all touched on some very important points in how Stand Your Ground is not the first law to come under scrutiny for its lack of equal protection under the law. In recent history, I think of the Batson ruling which allows relief for defendants when they claim there were discriminatory practices in jury selection. Unfortunately, in the case of our brother and political prisoner Mcneill Abu Jamal, the courts overturned their own precedences just to deny him this right. If you can just further elaborate on some other laws and cases in which the government has obviously turned its bias against us to further drive home with your points regarding Stand Your Ground.
Michael Cord isn't here. So,
well, based on your knowledge.
You know, I have to go back to my basic thesis that we're talking about extrajudicial killings. By extrajudicial, we're talking about outside the law. The law does not restrain these types of murders, nor does it punish the people who commit them. I think that it is a mistake to focus upon the law, because the law does not protect young black men. In fact, the law is in place to punish them. That is why you have this enormous prison population made up disproportionately of young black men. Because it is not a question of the law, it is a question of the political system that empowers white men and some black men to kill, in particular, young black men because they are not valued in this society, and they have been constructed and invented as a threat to the society. So therefore, a person like a George Zimmerman is a domestic terrorist, but he is not defined as such because he killed a black man. So he is protecting himself, and if we want to put it in the framework of the war against terrorism, so-called, he is protecting the homeland. And the terrorist is the young black man, albeit unarmed. It's the very fact of his race and his class. And he happened to be in the wrong place. If I could just say one last thing. You know, our people were brought to this country for our labor. Not just because white people were racist. There's evidence that probably most of them were not racist at the time of the transatlantic slave trade. Racism evolved, and as a result of the way racism evolved, white people, or people who were of different European ethnicities, became white, which means that they were not black. Today, our labor is not needed as it once was. We went from being a black proletariat to being a black precariat. Precariat meaning people whose lives are precarious. They might work, but they don't make enough to survive. Good part of the year, they don't have jobs. So it's easy for the media and the politicians to define these people as of no value to the society and target it for either imprisonment or assassination. This is, and I agree with Gabriel about this. We cannot separate this from stop and frisk. This is legalized, what do they call it? Racial profiling. It's a form of legal racial profiling. And so you see this web of repression and control and punishment of black folk in our society. Now, I guess I want to stop here, but I want to come back and suggest what the implications of this are and what it suggests in terms of the type of struggle that we are going to have to wage.
I'm just going to briefly piggyback off of Dr. Monteiro here. We're facing genocide. And we're facing genocide of the African American male. This is no different in our history. If you can look back, and not to go much on this, but we know that Africans were brought here for their labor, and it was specifically because the Native American was no good in the eyes of the white man. Thomas Jefferson called the Native American an ungovernable ally. He called him a waste. And so because they could not do the labor that the white man wanted him to do, they brought the African over. And when the Native American was of no use to the European, he was discarded. And we're beginning to see that even to this very day. The African American male, the African American, we're here for two reasons in our history. First, it was labor. Then it was entertainment. And so the labor part is gone. Now we're still here for entertainment, and folks are still being entertained. But you can't make money off of entertainment as much as you can with someone doing some real work. And unfortunately, many of the folks in our community, they're being left by the wayside, and they're being killed off, either physically or psychologically, mentally, and spiritually. We're being killed in the hopes of doing away with our people because there is no use. And this has happened throughout our history. This movie about, not to jump on a tangent, but this movie about Abraham Lincoln is killing me. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, before his grand idea of emancipating the slaves, he decided, look, let's get rid of these Africans. Let's move them out. And there were some gentlemen who were basically trying to exploit the United States for some money, exploit the Africans. And so you have this guy who buys this land in Panama, tells Lincoln, ha, bring them down here with me. I'll make sure that they get farming, they get landing, all that stuff. We'll make sure that they're good agriculture. They'll be fine. They shipped 400 African Americans down there. About 70 of them died in less than 2 weeks. It was a total fiasco. Lincoln never gets bought on this. Basically, it goes under the wayside. And so this was in 1862, during the Civil War. This continues on and on and on. And so my last point is that we have to be better students of history. We have to pay attention to the history of how our people have been dealt with in this nation, because history continues to repeat itself, and we're continuously doomed to be hit by the repetition of history because we have been desensitized to it, and so we're helpless mentally.
Just real quick, what I wanted to do is actually highlight my brother Abdul Sabor and his son. He's the father of Askia Sabor, who was recently freed on all accounts, being beat up by the police. And this is one of my old heads, as we say, in Philly. But one of the things that I've learned from him is that he's got a fierce legacy also of standing his ground in regards to change here in the city of Philadelphia. So I want to thank him for that. One thing that kind of comes to mind is the way that we position our language and our direction of an analysis of our people. I'll say it this way. The idea of driving while black is always key in our community, right? Driving while black. The better position is patrolling while racist. That's the question. Because see, it's not about driving while black. Because see, that victimizes the victim. All right? It puts the onus on the victim. Gabe, it's your fault for being black, for driving while black. You gotta make these changes. No, patrolling while racist. We gotta look at you, officer, who do what you did. So we have to figure out how we position language. All right? Secondly, we need to take a look at this idea about the hoodie question, because I think I want to emphasize what these two brothers said about the hoodies. That was a big deal last year, and all across the country. I mean, I swear, I wish that Skittles and Arizona Iced Tea made a statement about the Trayvon Martin, because everybody on Facebook and Instagram took pictures with Arizona Iced Teas and Skittles. And the funny thing is, nobody ever actually say a word. I mean, just out of just the idea, you would have thought maybe somebody would have just said a comment similar to what happened with The Onion about their comment about Queba Zanae Wallace in regards to the Academy Awards. All it takes is a simple comment. But I digress. I went to Lincoln University back in December and walked around for a trip. And around 80% of the black men, it was December, had hoodies on. That's what we do, right? That's what young people do. I went to Penn State University about a week later, all right, where the population, of course, is more Caucasian, all right? There's less people of color on this campus. About 80% of the white males I saw had hoodies on. Huh? And then I came back to Drexel University because we actually had a conference in my program in January, all right, cold day, all right? I just kind of walked around. I saw students of all colors with hoodies on. But one thing to consider is that we know and understand that there's more of an aggression coded to the African American and Latino males with hoods. We know that there's more of a coded idea of fear, more to those young African American males with hoodies, as well as there's more of an inference that they are going to participate in criminal behavior. And again, until we recognize the inner psychosis of society that basically says that you are the black monster, and I know I could relate being 6'5" in America, okay, all right? And if I didn't wear my suit and pants, in fact, sometimes when I do wear my suit, You know what I mean? I'm still, you know, the person that's talked about and caught up in some aggressive behavior by the so-called people that's supposed to be serving and protecting. All right? I think that in the final analysis, stand your ground law is really going to be one of the major law conversations, really probably for the next decade. Because right now, within each year, more governors and more elected officials are being proponents of signing bills like this into law. And so the onus becomes on you, all right? Are you going to be a frontline person that wants to agitate the marches? Maybe that's your role. But maybe your role is the person that says, you know what? I'm going to call my politician every day or every week or write letters. Because I know everybody's not going to do everything. And we know that in this movement, right? Everybody can't do everything, but you can do something, right? And so if it comes down to that piece, we can do that piece. But I think that, you know, for those in here who are in the School of Law or in schools of law around the country, this question of standing ground is going to be very critical. And, you know, it's going to set precedent. And in June, when Zimmerman's case starts, in June, it's going to be real critical that we all follow this with a very acute eye in regards to the evidence that's presented and the way in which Zimmerman and his defense tries to weasel themselves out of it. You know what I mean? But hopefully, as a community, we can also have the public opinion at bay to make sure that we also make sure that we have our words out there and that we assert our power as a community and as a people.
Thank you. You all have done an excellent job in dissecting Stand Your Ground and everything associated with it. But I want to shift gears and start talking about solutions. Start talking about what we need to do next as a community. First, I'd like to address, though, how we move people back to action. So these are all those people, as you mentioned, Gabe, who took the photos on Facebook and Instagram with their Skittles and iced teas, who attended the vigils, things of that nature, who got fired up initially, but then fell back. How do we move these people back to action? And then I also like to address what kind of struggle is necessary, Dr. Monteiro? What kind of struggle will we need to wage in order to start seeing some change in this country?
That's a big question. What kind of struggle to make change in this country? And I agree with you. We have to be about making change. And I would just put one word in front of change: fundamental change. I guess we have to be honest with ourselves and with the people that we hope to mobilize, first of all, and acknowledge that we pretty much live in a police state. Now, another word that we could use to describe this situation, and I hope I don't disturb anybody, but I think it's accurate. That word is crypto-fascist. The word crypto means disguised. You know, just like you can go out and vote in November, but both candidates pretty much saying the same thing when it comes to you. See what I'm saying? When it comes to people that look like us. Or they say the same things by not even mentioning you. But after the election, the mechanisms of control, punishment, and repression of you crank up to even a higher level. And that's at the federal, state, and local level. And that goes for both parties. I don't think, and this, Shasheena, I would say this: you can't have a great movement unless people are clear about what the situation is. If people have illusions about what exists, then they are going to be passive. So one of the most important things for activists, and you know, back in the days, we referred to ourselves as freedom fighters and unapologetically as revolutionaries. And I don't know that we want to go there these days.
Why not?
I hope we do. You know, because unless you have that perspective, you can't consistently lead people. Unless you believe that you are fighting not just to change a law, but to change a system, I don't think we can win. And I don't think we will be convincing to people. I'll end on this. The package has to be total. It just can't be, I'm going to fight in Philadelphia because they're closing down 37 schools. And then a person in Newark, New Jersey said, well, I'm going to fight in Newark, New Jersey because they're closing down public housing. And the person in New York says, well, I'm going to fight in New York on the stop and frisk. Or the occupied people say, well, I'm going to fight against the 1%. And on and on and on, segmented, divided battles. I think we have to have a holistic understanding of what we are dealing with. Now, the first thing I would say, we have to acknowledge that we are living in something like a police state. A police state. Now, we in Philadelphia, if you go back in the days, had and have had experiences with this. If you've ever heard of Rizzo, he went from the chief of police to the mayor, which meant that the police and the mayor's office were the same thing. You know, we called it Rizzoism, but we also called it Nazism and fascism. It was police rule. But this has become national policy. You know, when you have signed into law, into the Defense Authorization Act, the fact that if somebody says you are a terrorist, or associated with terrorists, or a friend of a terrorist, or said something complimentary about a terrorist, you could be locked up indefinitely. You see what I'm saying? Or the other aspects of undermining of the civil liberties and civil rights of ordinary citizens. The other thing is that we cannot separate what is going on in terms of this police state from what is going on in the economy. Why a police state? Why are the police so ruthless and vicious these days? Well, look at the unemployment numbers. Look at the poverty numbers. This is anticipatory violence. In other words, we anticipated that at some point you all might get angry enough to rise up and fight the system. You take Philadelphia as an example. You know, the mayor and the city council have raised the property taxes on everybody. You know, a lot of black people are going to be put out of their homes. A lot of poor people are going to lose their homes just because of taxes. At some point, people are going to get sick and tired of being sick and tired. So you have to look at the economy. The third thing that is in this mix is the American empire. You know, we always like to think of ourselves as a democracy. Purge that thought from your mind. Do some introspection. It's just like our standards of beauty. You know, what we believe is beautiful is usually given to us externally. Most of the time, what is beautiful does not look like most people in this room. If you understand where I'm coming from. So that's an external standard. You didn't come to that on your own. That's the same thing with this idea that this is a democracy. What we're dealing with is an empire.
That's right.
That's right.
A military empire. Did it ever occur to anybody that there's a relationship between the president's kill list and the kill list of the local police departments? If it is all right for the President of the United States to carry out extrajudicial assassination based upon a kill list, in the interest, as he would have it, of protecting our freedoms, then why shouldn't a George Zimmerman or a local cop kill X, Y, or Z, black or Hispanic man or woman, because that person is defined as a threat to his or her liberty? You understand where I'm coming from? That logic has to be challenged in its essence. I think that any great movement requires a great clarification of what the issues are. So we radicals, we revolutionaries, we freedom fighters, we people who stand our ground on the principles of justice and humanity must go to the people and explain to them precisely what the situation is, and then call for unity, the united front of the people against racism, injustice, and war. We have to call for united front for jobs. Can I just say one other thing? We just want to talk about, we want to talk about George Zimmerman, but we don't want to talk about Barack Obama. Did you notice when he went up to Connecticut to memorialize the children and people who were killed there by gun violence, he spoke one way that valued their lives and valued their communities, etc. And then when he went to Chicago, he only went there after the people mounted a petition drive and demanded that he come, even though Chicago is where he starts his political career. But when he goes to Chicago, he feels it necessary to objectify black people and to make the argument that, well, if you people acted differently, you'd have different outcomes. Remember that one? You're not a man because you can make a baby, you're a man because you can take care of a baby. Well, I thought you were coming there to talk about gun violence. And are black men the only ones that make babies and don't take care of them? Is that a universal problem, or is that just a black problem? And if the President of the United States talks like that to black people, and he's allegedly black, why shouldn't white racists talk about us like that and act in such ways that devalue our lives? So I think it's a holistic picture, and I think we need to think holistically. I think the organizers have to educate ourselves. We need meetings like this. The death and murder of Trayvon Martin cannot be in vain. We cannot let this just go by. And by that I mean, in his name, we must recommit ourselves to the most tenacious struggle for the rights of people in this country and against those who create the circumstances that lead to the murders of young men like Trayvon.
If I could make a few quick points. First, I think that what we have to remember is, one, not to minimize the life of Trayvon, but we have to, for any movement to be sustainable, we have to get behind a purpose. The purpose is what will keep people focused. Not that the people that are in the midst aren't important and that won't galvanize support. But from the graph that was just pointed up, we see that there was a high tide when this thing was going down last February. Now it's really trailed off. So we have to get behind the purpose. The second thing is we have to know what team we're on. And by that, I know I'm gonna open up a can of worms, but if we look at Trayvon, We know what team he was on. No one in society probably expected him to do much, didn't expect much of him. They thought, oh, he smokes weed in school and he's a bad kid, so he probably, it doesn't make a difference whether or not he's here or not, just like many people think of young black males. Now let's take a look at the gentleman named Christopher Dorner.
Come on.
Now that man fought for the United States. He wore the uniform. He went and became a police officer in Los Angeles. He wore the uniform. He fought on behalf to take Dr. Monteiro on behalf of the empire. He stood up for the values of the empire. Yet and still, when there was a moment where he saw the racist ways of the empire, he was gone. And when gone, he thought, he meditated, and this is not to excuse the murder of people. However, if we think back to the slave who was killed in often number of cases, the slave who was beaten, the slave who was separated from his family, if a slave did revolt, he not only killed the master, he killed the master's family. And so Christopher Dorner went after not only the people, but he went after their families. And this man was a part, at one point, of the empire. And so look what they did to Christopher Dorner. President Obama, not to jump on that bandwagon, but he has drones sent all over the world, not just bombing people who are supposed to be on the kill list, but bombing innocent people in places in the Middle East. They sent a drone looking for Christopher Dorner, looking to get him to kill him. When they found him in a cabin, they left him to burn. To burn. And so when we talk about, to Dr. Monteiro's point about the police state, there are repercussions for those that are on the wrong team, and repercussions if you leave the right team that we have to be aware of. I think the one issue for me most important when you talk about social movements, it has to be the movement for economic justice and economic rights. And to piggyback, our people need to have jobs, and jobs are not available. And the one thing that I think that's being lost in this whole discussion on the economy, no one wants to focus on culture, no one wants to focus on the inner person. What makes a man a man? What makes a man is the ability to provide, the ability to protect, and the ability to promote within his family. And when you strip that from any man, white, black, doesn't matter, when you strip that from him, then you've taken away the essence of who he is. And so to really build up our communities is to rebuild our men. And no one is willing to do that, because if you rebuild the men, that's where the strength is. And although the African American woman is just as strong, if not stronger, for her inner strength in holding things down, it is the man who is the leader, who is the driver. And when you take the driver from behind the wheel, you can have a car crash. And unfortunately, many of our households are crashing. So how do we get it back? We have to get jobs back in the communities where people need to get out and work. Believe me, men want to work. And if they can't find a legitimate job, they're going to work an illegitimate job. But they're working. And so we have to get that back. We have, if we're going to fight for anything, we have to fight for the economic justice, so that way we can rebuild our families, we can rebuild our communities, and we can begin to take the politics back for our community.
Can I just say one short, just reference to patriarchy. we want jobs, but we don't want to go back to the 1950s either. And we want jobs for men and women, equal pay, universal child care, health care. So, I support the family, but I think we have to think in terms of a new type of family. And families come in all forms these days. And I don't want to, but just be careful on that patriarchy.
I'm now inclined to respond. I think that what we have to do is, in order to, and maybe I'll throw this out there, we of course have to have the economic rights, but we have to have the civil rights as well. And going back to the fear comment, people are afraid of everything nowadays. We're so fear-driven with everything, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality. We have to fight for the rights of everybody. To your point earlier about the proletariat, we all are the same. If you look around this room, we may look different, we may sound different, we may act different in certain types of ways, but we're all the same. We have some of the same struggles, we have some of the same dreams, we have some of the same aspirations. And in our nation, too often, we've been divided. And so these issues that come out, that we hear in these political discussions that are these talking heads are discussing, we have to get beyond the surface level divisions that scare us away from one another and get down to the core root of issues and just fight for those rights so that everyone can get exactly what they need in society.
I was recently doing a workshop with some of my young girl students, and it revolved around trying to break down rape culture in America. And if it's anything that we know about rape culture, one of the things that happens, unfortunately, is that sometimes what happens is we point the finger and say, if you had only been not wearing that, you wouldn't have been raped. Taking the onus off of the raper. And I think it's in that context that we need to be very clear on the question of who is being disenfranchised and who is the person that's doing it. And I think one of the things that I would say, first of all, as a solution is that, again, we need to control our own forms of media, which is why I'm so happy that I see multiple cameras in the room. I see multiple journalists in the room. I see multiple folks who represent many different literary avenues. Because, see, one of the things that I hate is that whenever there's a story about a young person in this country, particularly in the city of Philadelphia, I can only speak for this, of course, for this context, they'll preface it in the media by saying, the reports show also that Gabe Bryant had 3 prior offenses. God damn it, what do those 3 prior offenses got to do with him getting his head blown off by the police? Let's be very clear about that. Do you know what I mean? And that always tends to happen if you look at the key, so-called mainstream media print operations. They still kind of get caught up in that conservative avenue. So again, give thanks to all the independent media out here. 2 is we have to do and emphasize, I think, 2 fields for our youth. One is this whole question of law and jurists. I mean, part of the reason why Michael Court, I'm sure, isn't here is because he has to be everywhere. Huh? Let's be honest. He is the so-called conscious lawyer, the so-called civil rights guy, right? In the same effort as people like Leon Williams and others in the great city of Philadelphia. But unfortunately, whenever it comes to an issue, these same few individuals are called on to be everywhere. And what we have to do is, and unfortunately, the Philadelphia School District does not prepare our students to be the proper literary agents that they need to be, layman's terms, able to read, right? But the whole point is that we need to prepare some young folks to get into the law field really with a specific purpose to be able to demystify it so that when issues such as John Mcneill and Marissa Alexander and all the cases that were just mentioned, we can be the ones in those courtrooms. Because see, again, this is war. This is asymmetrical warfare, which means that we got to be everywhere. And if your role is to be in the courtroom, guess what? Thank the Creator that it was you who was in the courtroom, who came to this session at Drexel back in February, who got something in your mind and say, you know what? I do want to be a lawyer, and I do want to be able to be in those cases when it comes down to staying your ground in the future. Give thanks. Huh? The other piece to that is the role of mental health and trauma. Because see, I can say just working with young people here in the city of Philadelphia, my program's in 30 high schools. And when I see these young men who tell me that not only do they don't give a damn about the cops or the police, they've been beaten multiple times, they've been hit multiple times, they've been racial profiled multiple times, and we never discuss the trauma, the inherent trauma of our children and young folks who are not only, profiled by the police, but really not having you wonder why they don't care about themselves to a certain extent. We feel as though they pulled it out of osmosis, out of the air. I don't care about myself in my life. No, they got it from us adults. Let's be very clear. And until we're able to, again, quantify and qualify some level of proactive operation that's going to address the trauma that is permeating our children and our youth, because again, the story of Trayvon Martin is sad, but also what's sad is the children in Sanford, Florida, who have to deal with the fact that for the past year and a half, they had a boy die in their neighborhood, cameras is everywhere, and they feel unsafe. Because this cat Zimmerman was in our neighborhood. Who else was Zimmerman? Huh? I read a story from some children on the paper saying that some children were saying that they were having nightmares because all they saw was Zimmerman in the neighborhood. Huh? This is real talk, y'all. I'm not making this up. And so the thing about it is we need to address the question of law, the question of mental health. One thing I want to talk about also about staying your ground is that we got to specify staying your ground from the castle law. So again, we talked about, every man's home, quote unquote, is their castle, right? So we can, we have all these measures. But the specifics about staying the ground, why it's so controversial, is because you can be anywhere. Let's be specific about this, right? So the castle can include your home. It can also include any occupied space. So it can include your car or your workplace. That's under the castle doctrine, okay? But stand your ground says, just like it is with Zimmerman, we could be out on 33rd and Chestnut, huh? And I feel threatened from you, and all of a sudden, guess what? Because I got my, as the kids say, my ratchet, my burner on it, hit my hammer, you're done for. And so what's already been proven in the case that, and in the studies that Shasheena mentioned earlier about, that came out of Texas A&M, which I would say also, please study it. Don't take it for her, honor, study it for yourself. But it proved that it did not actually break down the crime rate. In fact, it increased homicides. It increased the homicides. These stand your ground laws. There's been an increase. And so again, we need to pay attention to effects and do the necessary analysis to break down the numbers and figure out what is the efficacy of our legislation and policies, bottom line. And I'll end here by saying, we have to study. One of the things that Dr. Monteiro kept mentioning was extrajudicial. And the Malcolm X grassroots movement, MXGM, you can go to mxgm.org, put together an excellent report. It's a report on the extrajudicial killings of black people in America called Every 36 Hours. It basically makes the assertion that a black person in this country is killed every 36 hours by some aspect of law enforcement / security in this country, every 36 hours. Check the report for yourself, all right? I don't want to go too deep into it. But I would just say, do the study, but also learn from the elders and experiences who have been doing this and fighting for the long haul. With that, I want to highlight my sister, Pan Africa, who's here today. Pan Africa has been on the move for 30 years for Mcneill. And so when it comes down to us figuring out what do we need to do, she's a sister who is a living embodiment of what we need to do, because now Mumia Abu Jamal is off of death row and we're still working to get him out of prison. right? And I'm sure people said to her 30 years ago, it's never gonna happen, Pam. And that 30 years ago, it happened. So the problem is that we think that we want everything to be overnight, but we don't understand that change is not overnight. And it's the ones that are willing to go for the long haul that are going to see the victory and the triumph that we get to see as a people and as a community. I'll end by saying this, by a simple raise of hands, how many people in this room are a member of some organization? That's beautiful to see. That's beautiful to see. And what I would say is on our way in, we need to do two things. If you didn't raise your hand, come to some of the ones that did, ask about it and join one. All right, ask about what they're doing. Hopefully it's for the betterment of our people in some regard, which shape or form. Join one, or if you don't find anything that you connects to your interests, start one yourself. Right. And really be about that business, because it's not enough to just talk about this stuff and not be the agent of change that we want to do once everybody leaves those doors in about an hour, if not sooner. Right. So do those things, exchange numbers, figure out the next program, figure out the next movement, and really be about the business of doing what we need to do as a community to kind of affect the change so that these little ones coming up under us don't say, dang, what did those adults do during our time when this whole world was going to piss?